Western medicine, pharmaceuticals are often used to suppress a symptom. It's kind of this heavy-handed approach of like, the body is doing this thing, and so I'm going to lay down the law and make it do this other thing by taking this, pharmaceutical. And pharmaceuticals are rarely healing in nature. Whereas as an herbalist, I'm always thinking, what is the body doing now? What is the body trying to do? How can we turn to herbs to assist in that healing process?
Hello, and welcome back to the Wellbe podcast, a weekly series designed to help you learn, expand what you thought was possible, and become as empowered as you can possibly be in your health. I'm your host, Nolan-Smith, a board-certified holistic patient advocate and the founder of Wellbe. And today I'm bringing you a brand new episode with Rosalee de la Foret, a registered herbalist, all about how to use herbs to heal and prevent symptoms and chronic health issues. Before we jump in, if you've ever listened to the Wellbe podcast before and you haven't yet left a review, please do so right now. You don't even have to stop listening to this episode. Just scroll all the way down on the Wellbe podcast page in your app and click Write a Review. You can give it a few stars and a few words and then press Submit in the top right-hand corner. It's super fast and easy, but actually very important for any podcast, so thank you so much for doing that right now. Herbs or herbal therapy played a big role in my healing from chronic Lyme disease over 20 years ago. It also helped me when I faced amenorrhea in college. So needless to say, I was really intrigued to speak to a registered herbalist and understand exactly how herbs work, because I was just 11 when I first started herbal therapy for Lyme disease, and back then to me it seemed like just magic or witchery, like, oh here, drink this tree bark and you'll feel better and that sort of thing. But that's not actually it at all. And now that I've seen major universities like Johns Hopkins School of Medicine coming out with published studies about herbal therapy for Lyme disease and citing so many other uses for herbal therapy, it's hammered home for me just how powerful and, most importantly, natural and long-standing a therapy it is. If you think about it, it's really the oldest and, as a result, or at least to me, the most proven therapy in the history of the world. Here is Rosalee de la Foret to tell us more about the difference between herbs and herbal medicine, why herbalism is more complicated than just swapping an herb for a prescription drug, where you can buy herbs to use at home that are high quality, how to determine which way to take herbs. Obviously, there are teas, capsules, tinctures, salves, etc. And last but not least, the differences between antibiotics and herbs against bacteria, which I found to be such a fascinating part of this episode. Here is Rosalee. Rosalee, thank you so much for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, Adrienne.
Yes, this is a topic I've long wanted to cover, and having a registered herbalist to explain it all will be so helpful for me and my whole community. So first, what or who first sparked your passion for herbs and natural medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. One that I ask myself a lot because I can see all these like different paths that, kind of brought me to where I am today. And, one thing I remember is being like maybe around 10 years old, and I went on a hike, like a guided hike. And the guide was talking about, the geological formations of the hike, all that kind of stuff. And he showed us this plant and told us that it was used for tea and invited us to just like take off a bit of that plant and taste it. And I remember that just like blew my mind. I just like couldn't believe it, which is kind of, a sign of how disconnected I was from nature at that age. But just the idea that you could like walk along a trail and take a plant and eat it or use it for tea was just like, wow, I just thought it was so cool. And for years, I remember like I'd see that plant with friends and I'd be like all knowing, like, let me tell you about this plant. So I definitely felt that, pulling me from a very young age. And as a teenager, I loved natural health. I was a super nerd. Like I got my driver's license. And I remember one of my first thoughts being like, now I can drive myself to the health food store.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been like, woven throughout. And it was always just, like as long as I can remember, just an interest and kind of hobby, I guess. And then in my early 20s, I got really ill with a rare autoimmune disease. And it was like through that process of healing and turning to herbs for healing that I just had this huge paradigm shift of how powerful herbs and holistic health can be.
Yeah, of course. I think like many of us, there's some sort of health issue that makes you realize you could be doing things differently or harnessing the power of different healing modalities. And then most of us are so amazed at what we were able to accomplish with that healing, or upset by what happened before that happened, that it inspires us to make a career change. That's certainly what happened to me. And it sounds like it fueled your desire to go into herbalism. And I know that's a theme that I've heard through many of the experts that have been on the WellBe show and podcast. All right. So what did you do when you had this rare autoimmune disease, and how did herbs actually help you?
I had this like crazy set of symptoms. I had this high fever at night that would disappear in the daytime. And I had severe aches and pains in my joints. And I was, just didn't really get out of bed for weeks. And then I eventually landed in the hospital and took some time there and a whole team of specialists. And then I was told, I have this rare autoimmune disease called Still's disease. And I did not have a good prognosis. They told me that they could give me prednisone or steroids for now, but that they wouldn't work in time, and that I could expect to have a declining quality of life until life expectancy around age 40. And that was it. I mean, they gave me a brochure. They literally gave me a brochure and was like, good luck. So, which, like looking back on it, I'm kind of glad that that's how it went down, because it was kind of like Western medicine just like shut the door in my face and was just like, nope, can't help you. There's no cure for this. Good luck. And so I pretty immediately, pivoted and started seeing all sorts of holistic practitioners, acupuncture, herbalists, naturopaths, and, began working on looking at my diet. At the time, I've always been interested in natural health. So at the time I was eating a so-called healthy diet. It was all organic and consisting mainly of like soy and wheat, really. I was, young 20s. So I just was like doing the best I could, but it wasn't, really great. So I reinvented my diet, and then I took a lot of herbs. I took a lot of Chinese herbs at the time, and within 6 months, I didn't have symptoms anymore. And so that was really, again, that like paradigm shift, because Western medicine had just been like, sorry, here's some steroids. It's going to suck from here on out for you. And when I went and saw all these practitioners, they were just like, oh yeah, let's work with you and let's get you better. And they did. And so I was just like, wow, like supposedly this like alternative health is like quackery. That's, not really like for serious issues, but that definitely changed my mind about that. So that just completely changed my whole life. And I knew that I wanted to sink further into that from my own learning and be able to help others as well.
Amazing. That is a lot more than just you had a rare autoimmune disease. That's very serious. So it's very impressive what you were able to accomplish with that healing. So there are a lot of myths about herbal medicine. And I think, if you don't have knowledge about herbs or herbal medicine, you're thinking right now that maybe herbs are just basil, cilantro, mint, right? Or something that Chinese people have used for many years with things like, tiger balm, or they make some teas with herbs and things like that. But in fact, there's much more to it. So would you mind explaining some of the myths you've heard over the years about herbal medicine, and can you debunk any of them for us?
Sure. I like the way you framed that question, because that is kind of some common simplistic views of herbs. And I would say there's herbs and there's herbalism or herbal medicine. And in some ways, I think people sometimes confuse herbs for herbal medicine, which by that I mean with herbal medicine, it's a whole system of healing. So it's not simply about saying like, oh, I'm currently taking this pharmaceutical drug. I don't want to take it anymore, so I'm going to take herbs because they're natural, and then like substituting the two. That's using herbs, but that's not using herbal medicine. And so I think that's something that often gets like lost in the, learning of things, is that you can just like take herbs without really understanding kind of this deeper way or method of approaching herbs, using herbs, prescribing herbs, we could say. So that's kind of a big myth, I think. I know a lot of people like probably like myself, get started by like wondering, like what herb is good for eczema? What herb is good for insomnia? Whatever, fill in the blank issue. And then think that like you just get like like, oh, take this herb. And sometimes that works, honestly. Sometimes you can get that slam dunk kind of thing, but more often than not, it's a little bit more complex than that because it isn't just substituting herbs for drugs. So I think that's a big myth out there. And one that's harmful because I think people might be interested in herbs and then they do try that herb for eczema or whatever the thing is, and it doesn't work the way they wanted it to. And then it's kind of like, oh, herbs don't work, because it wasn't. But yeah, it's a big difference between just like taking a this for that situation versus really using herbal medicine within a greater context. Another myth that I think is common is one way I think in which Western researchers or medicine approaches herbs is they want to know what are the bioavailable constituents or what are like the most active constituents within an herb. And so they want to really, they approach it in a reductionist way. They want to just use those constituents. And there's a lot of, pros and cons, I guess you could say behind that, or just reasonings. But in herbalism, we value and know that it's not just these individual constituents within an herb that are valuable, but really the whole herb and the whole experience around that herb too. So that's another thing that, people might say, that they want to just use standardized extracts, but, we're really missing out on a lot if we aren't working with whole herbs.
It's always stuck with me that, the pharmaceutical world or the Western medicine world, they like to extract whatever it is that they've been able to isolate as the thing that's, most effective. But what they don't realize is that nature is a beautiful harmony of things and that there's a reason for everything, right? And so a lot of times that isolate or that extract needs the other parts of that plant. That's also the whole idea, right, between eating like a whole food is that, the sugar of a fruit can be more damaging if not consumed with the fiber to slow it down and help with blood sugar regulation, all of that. So I think people forget that that's the same thing with herbs, and that just because you were able to identify or isolate some part of it that's very healing doesn't mean you should take it out. Like maybe there's a reason it's coming in the whole form that it's in.
I like that comparison between food because I think that's something that people can relate to. We know that like just juicing something and missing out on all those other nutrients within the plant is not necessarily helpful, like you said. And this, same thing goes for plants. And we see science catching up with that. Like, for example, there's a lot of talk about antioxidants and, antioxidant this and, addressing inflammation. And so they've tried to create like the antioxidant pill. And studies are showing like that actually doesn't work. But what does work is eating whole foods and whole herbs because there is so much going on, not just these like simple antioxidants.
Yeah. So I think that people who are familiar with herbs or who already use herbs understand generally, where to start if they had an ailment or they wanted to go further down a path using herbs. But most people, I think it's completely off limits, right? Mentally, they might have a CVS or a Walgreens, and that's primarily where they would go get something if there was an ailment. Maybe they have a Whole Foods or a health food store, and they might go to that section of sort of medicinal things if they were having a stomach ache or a headache or something, if they didn't want to go to a drugstore and look for something there. But I think it's still very unclear to the majority of people, is that herbal? Is that herbal medicine if I get it at a health food store? Or do I need to go to like an actual herbalist who's, grinding the herbs up and putting them in capsule form and things like that? So would you just kind of treat us like children and walk us through, herbalism from the stuff you might find at a health food store or in that sort of, medicinal section to the kind of herbalism I'm talking about with the grinding up, and what do you use for what? Walk us through it.
Okay. Well, as you were speaking, I thought, some of the best herbal medicine is actually found in the produce section of a supermarket. So things like ginger and garlic and mint, those are all really, powerful herbal medicines that are very accessible to folks and can be found in most grocery stores. So definitely that's herbal medicine. And going to the herbal section of a health food store, you might find bulk herbs, which you can just buy, like a couple spoonfuls of chamomile or, something like that. Or, there's a lot of teas already in tea bags. All of that is herbal medicine. The difference then when you see a practitioner is that they might be creating customized formulas for a person. So that is a big part of herbalism, is figuring out, looking at classic formulas and then adjusting them for the person that's actually sitting in front of you. And some people wildcraft their herbs. Some people, get them from specific suppliers. So there's a lot of different ways we can source herbal medicine too.
Herbs are plants that have medicinal properties, and they range from things that you can just add to food like basil and herbs and mint and things like that, which can be very healthful, and garlic and ginger and whatever, to plants that maybe you wouldn't necessarily eat in food, but that are very, very medicinal and that you might take in like a tea form or capsule form. Mm-hmm. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's
or used in some sort of like topical salve if it was a burn or something like that.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll come across people, especially like gardeners or somebody who thinks like herbs have like a very defined definition, like they are herbaceous plants that, die back every year. That's kind of one definition of herbs. But in the like herbal medicine world, we call everything an herb, whether it's like cinnamon, which is a bark, and we sometimes even call medicinal mushrooms an herb. So it's kind of like natural medicinal substance what could go under the herb. So yeah, like you said, everything from garlic to even special preparations like alcohol extracts or tinctures, all of that being herbal medicine.
Got it. Okay, so if somebody was listening to this and saying, I've been relying far too long on Advil or this other thing for headaches or period cramps or whatever, and I'd really like to clean all that out and get some herbal remedies for these things, but they have no idea, should I be taking it in capsule form, in tea form? Should I be trying to eat it? Where would I go? Where would you start?
Yeah, there is so much to learn about herbs. Like you said, not just like what to take, but how to take it and for how long and on and on and on. So if somebody is at that like very beginning stage, but they know that they want to start looking at herbal medicine to address some of their existing issues or, to maintain health, I think working with a practitioner is going to be your best first step. But, when you work with someone experienced, they can help you with all of those things of figuring out what are the herbs that are for you. Because as we've talked, there's not just like the herb for eczema, right? We're looking at people and what might be the best herb for them. And then also helping with all of those things like how do you formulate those herbs? How much do you take for how long? All of those things are really, necessary to get results with herbs. But, herbal medicine is also super approachable. So we don't have to be overly complicated about things like when there's, more simple things. Like, for example, if somebody has nausea in their life, ginger is kind of like you can pretty much turn to ginger to address, minor tummy troubles and nausea, and it's going to work a lot of the time. So there's things like that do lend themselves to like a quick fix. But anytime there's more of like a specific concern, then you're going to want to work with someone to get the best results.
Got it. Okay. So you wouldn't say try to self-teach yourself what to go find in a food store and create you're not saying you should turn into an herbalist if you're just interested in accessing them. You probably want to see a registered herbalist. That would be your advice?
Well, Adrienne, I do want to say that I think everyone should be an herbalist. So there is that. But, if somebody was just saying, like I have this one issue and I just want to use, I want to use something more natural like herbal medicine to fix it, then working with someone's going to be your best bet. But I think a lot of people like myself, you start using herbs, you start getting curious, you start wanting, to learn more and more. And in that sense, like absolutely everyone can study herbalism. I've gone to over 8 years of clinical training for herbs. You don't have to commit to that. But again, we could use more herbalists. So if you find that you want to, Great. But it can start with those simple things of just like learning a little bit about this. And I often recommend that people start learning, in the very beginning, they could learn about one herb. And oftentimes there is something out there that just kind of like has piqued their interest and they're curious about. Could be something like garlic or turmeric, which is really popular. Maybe it's something that's growing in their garden, but just something they'd like to learn about. And you could just start there and get to know that one herb. Because as we've discussed, there's so many things to know about an herb, not just like a list of what it's good for, but also, like how do you make herbal remedies with that herb? Is it best as a tea? Is it best taken as a powder in a capsule? Or do you make an alcohol extract out of it? So there's so many ways of knowing plants and getting to know plants. So I both, all are recommended. But when somebody comes to me and says, I have insomnia, what herb do I take? I know that person's probably going to be disappointed, if they go to their browser and type in like what herb is good for insomnia and they just start randomly taking herbs. They're probably not going to get great results. I would hope that they do. I don't mean to be a naysayer, but it's going to be unlikely. So in that situation, when you have a particular ailment and you want help with that ailment, I think it is helpful to work with a practitioner.
So I'll just share some of my different experiences with herbs, both from figuring things out on my own and then working with practitioners. Like you said, you can use herbs for some mild discomfort. So I do turn to ginger for any sort of, menstrual cramps or any kind of nausea. I had a very bad burn on my back from actually a heating pad this summer and turned to, one of my favorite Chinese herbal salves that I ordered just on Amazon. But I used to live in China, lived there 3 different times from age 16 to 23. So I knew from my host family and other Chinese people in my life, the power of some of these things. And they're quite inexpensive, honestly, compared to some other drugstore burn creams and without any side effects. It's just purely natural. So that worked wonders. I was using it every single day and it was just amazing how much the scar went away and, just really impressive. And then when I was healing from chronic Lyme disease, when I was a teenager or a tween, I guess I was diagnosed when I was 11 and kind of rid of it when I was 13 or in remission. And my mother found a Chinese herbalist in Flushing. I grew up in New York City and we would travel out routinely. He would sort of evaluate me and put together these custom formulas like you were talking about based on both Lyme disease and just me as a patient. And I took these in the form of horrible smelling teas. I mean, horrible.
I've been there. I know that.
Oh my gosh. And horrible tasting. Whoa, so bitter. Luckily, I think things have changed since then. And like you said, a lot of these things are put into extracts, so into alcohol, and you can just put some drops of that in water and, swig it down that way. And it's a little bit easier, or in capsule form. At the time, the teas were the way to go. I'd be 12 years old. My whole house would stink of these teas and I'd be having play dates and my friends are going, what is that? And why do you have to drink it? And looking back is kind of funny, but at the time I was like, oh, this is brutal. But I have to say it was one of a handful of therapies that I used because antibiotics were no longer effective once I found out that I had Lyme. I never saw a tick bite and I put it into remission. So I really credit the herbs that I took in tea form for making my life tough at age 12, but also very effective healing therapy. And I've since interviewed for the WellBe Show and podcast, Dr. Bill Rawls, who is a great Lyme disease specialist and who healed himself of Lyme using only herbs. And we've gone through all the different, chronic Lyme treatments that are out there. And really, when you look at effectiveness, cost, and safety, herbs are really the best option. It's going to take a little bit longer than maybe also using some of these other, treatments that might speed up the process, but most effective, most economical, and safest, chronic Lyme option out there. So extremely powerful. And I know there are other conditions besides Lyme. Can you talk about some of the other conditions that respond best to healing by herbs?
Well, I want to say all of them, like all the things, Adrienne, all the things. But one that pops into my head right away is digestive issues. Recently, I was just thinking about kind of the insanity of PPIs, the proton pump inhibitors, and how detrimental they can be to digestion. And it's kind of like this typical situation where you have, a wound or some kind of challenge in your digestive system. And then one of the most recommended things is to take a PPI, often long-term, which is detrimental. And it does nothing to like actually heal your digestion at all. And in fact, we know it can make things much worse, especially the longer you take it. So let's just talk about like you get a PPI if you have like heartburn or GERD, and sometimes prescribed also with an ulcer. And the idea being that they're thinking that you have excessive hydrochloric acid. And so the PPI comes in and shuts that down. So you no longer have excessive hydrochloric acid. So what an herbalist might think, let's say someone comes with an ulcer and they might think, oh, well, how can I assist this person and their body in healing that ulcer? So an example might be, it's not like the one herb, but we might use demulcent herbs and vulnerary herbs. And these are herbs that are healing to tissues and that they help stimulate the healing of wounds, essentially, because the ulcer is basically a wound, a digestive wound. And so those herbs can be soothing. They can coat the ulcer so they can bring, immediate pain relief. But they can also stimulate those tissues to start to regrow and actually heal the ulcer. When you have an ulcer, the tissues can be kind of lax, swollen. And so we can use astringent herbs, which tighten and tone those tissues, again, helping with that healing process. So we can use herbs to heal the wound. And really, you're just working with herbs as a way of like stimulating your body's own natural healing to help take care of that wound. Then we want to think like a bigger picture, like why did this ulcer happen in the first place? And there's a lot of reasons for that could be looked at, but let's just take like the most standard or obvious and common of just like the poor digestive health. We can be using herbs to help strengthen and tone the digestive system. Of course, we definitely want to be looking at diet and making sure that the way they're eating is really working for them. But herbs can be a really big part of this too. For example, a favorite tradition in herbalism is taking bitters. And bitters are referring to this whole classification of herbs that have a bitter taste. And that bitter taste actually stimulates all sorts of wonderful actions in the digestive system. In some ways, we see it as like challenging the digestive system. So it's, kind of help propelling things along. Like the idea being if you just ate white potatoes day in and day out, that would be hard on your digestive system. It'd be hard nutritionally, but hard on your digestive system. And you're just eating like this one, starchy substance all the time. And you wouldn't be challenging your digestive system in any way. It's kind of like similar, we think of like movement, if you just like took a 20-minute walk on flat ground every single day, nothing wrong with that, of course, but if that's like the only movement you did every day, then, you would never be like challenging your muscles and your flexibility, your strength, et cetera. So it's kind of same deal with bitters. Bitters go in as soon as you have a bitter flavor on your tongue, you start to salivate, which creates this whole cascade of digestive events. Of course, your saliva being important for breaking down carbohydrates. And then that actually increases a healthy amount of hydrochloric acid in your stomach. It helps release the pancreatic enzymes. Bitter taste also stimulates the production and release of bile, which helps digest fats. So in this case, what we're really doing is we're not just saying like, oh, not assuming that someone has an excessive hydrochloric acid, and we're not simply taking something to like turn off that acid and thereby just, the so-called Band-Aid solution. Instead, we're saying like, how can we help that ulcer to heal? So that's taken care of. And then how can we create a better environment in that digestive system that's more resilient, that can help, stop this ulcer from happening in the future as well.
That's so interesting. So as you were describing that, I had this very simplistic question as a follow-up. What is the main difference between taking a pharmaceutical for a chronic health issue and taking herbs for a chronic health issue? So you used an ulcer, for example, and I was talking about chronic Lyme, but there are so many of them out there. What is the main difference?
I mean, just to be like a somewhat overly simplistic comparison between the two, is that Western medicine pharmaceuticals are often used to suppress a symptom. It's kind of this heavy-handed approach of like, the body is doing this thing, and so I'm gonna, lay down the law and make it do this other thing by taking this, pharmaceutical. And pharmaceuticals are rarely healing in nature, right? They aren't like, if you take something for high blood pressure, you aren't actually getting to the reason of why you have high blood pressure. Or if you have insomnia and you take a benzodiazepine, that's not addressing why you have insomnia. It's just this like super heavy-handed approach. Whereas with herbalism, you really, like, as an herbalist, I'm always thinking, what is the body doing now? What is the body trying to do? How can we turn to herbs to assist in that healing process? So there's a lot more trust that our bodies are ultimately the healers, and also that our body is striving towards wellness. And so what we're here to do is reach out to herbs and kind of get a little assistance, right? Sometimes we need an assistance. I think about, with my own autoimmune disease, I was told there's no cure. You take prednisone. Prednisone is not a cure. It's just stopping inflammation from happening and kind of controlling the immune system a bit. So it's not a cure. Eventually, like, I'm going to continue down this road and, end up dead at the age of 40. That's what they told me. Whereas when I took herbs, it's saying like, what is going on in the body? For me, I think it was intestinal permeability. That's my guess. I didn't have a biopsy, but that's my guess. And I think all of those things I did helped to like heal the situation that was going on. And so, 6 months later, I didn't have symptoms, and I haven't had symptoms yet because that situation was healed, which isn't to say that like, I, wouldn't want to be overly simplistic or make like miracle cure promises. Not every disease out there can be magically cured by herbs, but there is a lot of healing that can happen with herbs, and really getting at that, core situation or core problem. I also just want to feel like I should, give the caveat that like, because herbalism, it works within a holistic system like functional medicine. It's not just the things that we swallow that's going to make a difference in our health. It's not just about swallowing herbs instead of swallowing drugs, right? There's all those other things that go along with it. Like, I was thinking of a client that I had who had insomnia, and she had been taking benzodiazepines, and through our work together, we started talking about things more, and she was weaning off the benzodiazepines. And then like, basically it came down to the fact that she hated her job. She had a horrible boss who made unrealistic demands of her. And it was ultimately like, quitting that job and getting, a better job for her that solved her insomnia. So it's not, like it's just the things that we take, but it is looking at it within this much bigger perspective of our lives.
One of the things that I've always explained to people about natural medicine and seen myself, and as I mentioned with my Lyme experience, it wasn't like the only thing I did to heal was take herbs. Herbs were part of a system that I was, or a protocol that involved changing my diet and taking certain supplements for micronutrient deficiencies and, moving my body and these other things. Or if you, had a major trauma, maybe, you needed to release that and take herbs to heal something, or it's usually a combination. And the same way that herbs work as holistic medicine, herbs are part of a holistic approach. And you can't just take an Advil, put it aside and change over to this herb and expect that that's going to solve everything. Sometimes you have to look at all the things that might be contributing to that chronic illness or that chronic symptom. But one thing that I love about herbs that I wanted to mention that I learned from Dr. Rawls is that when it comes to killing microbes, right? And a lot of our chronic diseases come from microbes, come from bad bacteria, fungus, viruses, parasites, things like that, that are in our gut, that have somehow taken more control than our good bacteria. Therefore, our immune system isn't able to conquer them. And that's certainly what happens with Lyme and a lot of other infections. Antibiotics go in and wipe out the bad bacteria, but they also wipe out all of the good bacteria, which is essentially your army, your protectors, your defense people. So when the dust settles, the bad can grow back easily because there's no good to, protect you. With herbs, I'm hoping you'll take this from me and explain it much further, but my understanding is that it can be very effective for killing off infections and microbes because the herbs know to target the bad microbe, but not touch the other good cells, which is the major difference between antibiotics and herbs. And that's what makes them so powerful. Now they're more gentle, so it takes a little bit longer maybe, which is why if you were dying in the hospital, you might, antibiotics would be the right tool to use at that time. But for these longer term chronic infections, herbs are such a wonderful tool. Can you tell us a little bit more about, how they target these bad microbes and the differences between kind of like the antibiotic approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. And one that I think we're continually trying to understand. How do herbs work? We don't really know all the time how herbs work. We just see the results. But in terms of, what you're saying, one thing that herbs can do is they can inhibit quorum sensing. And so they can break up biofilms, which are a difficult thing to address. And so they go in there and they disrupt these biofilms from happening, which can, make bacteria more susceptible to being, taken care of and removed from the body. So they can do interesting things like that. And we know that, through the studies of them and seeing, how that happens, like in Petri dishes and that sort of thing. The other thing that herbs can do is they can address tissue states, which I was kind of talking about with the ulcer. With ulcer, we're looking at the tissue state. We're envisioning this wound that, these lax tissues, these swollen tissues, and especially in the digestive system, we can use things to tighten and tone tissues. And so we can make that less easier for bacteria to adhere to cell walls. That's often used for things like digestive infections. It's used for urinary infections. We're using herbs to help the bacteria, so they don't adhere to those cell walls, so they don't replicate there, and instead can be flushed out of the body. And yeah, like you said, there aren't herbs that go in and kill everything like an antibiotic. And yes, sometimes, that can be a life-saving thing. But I do wish there was more of this first approach of looking, what is the tissue state? How can we use herbs to address this particular infection? And, certain herbs are better at addressing one type of bacteria than another. So it can be very helpful to know what exactly you're dealing with. I actually have a story about a bacterial infection that I had a couple years ago. I just suddenly, just very quickly, I got this rash on my skin and, it came up super fast. It was gross. It was red. It was hot. It was oozing. And it came on so fast that I was just, made an appointment to see my doctor. And the doctor, took a look at it, said, let's take a culture of it. Might be staph or something like that. So took a culture. And the culture came back this, weird bacteria. I don't remember what it was now, but I remember the doctor was even surprised, ooh, what is that? Why is that there? And said, unfortunately, this is, a drug-resistant bacteria. So, we can try and give you some topical stuff, just not sure it's going to work though. So gave me a topical thing, started putting it on. I put it on as directed, for 5 days, nothing changed. I mean, it didn't even touch it. At which point I was kind of okay, duh, I will turn to herbs now. I think just the severity of it and how quickly it came on just kind of got me a little bit startled. So I just went this other route. So I started putting herbs on it. And within 24 hours, it was reduced by half. And within a week, it was gone. And that's stopping that antibacterial cream and instead using herbs. And it was a great moment for me, but it was also one of those moments. And this is a moment I've had so many times where I just think, what do people do when they don't have herbs? What would have been that situation? They gave me this antibacterial cream. It totally didn't work at all. Would I have been given another cream? Would it then be, would I then be taking systemic antibiotics for this situation that's on, a rash? Anyway, I think about that. What do people do without herbs? And and how did the herbs work in that situation? Well, one thing is that antibiotics, they have this one mechanism for entering bacteria and then killing bacteria. And the way that things become antibiotic resistant is that the bacteria develop ways to avoid that. They're evolving and they don't like being killed. So they, evolve to not be killed by these simplistic antibiotics. And that's why more and more antibiotics are being created, is because they need different ways to kill the bacteria. With plants, they're so complex and they work in so many different ways that it's not as easy to just there's no one door that the bacteria can shut to keep out herbs. Herbs have all these different mechanisms for acting against them. As an example, there's something in plants, berberine containing plants like Oregon grapefruit, which is Mahonia, or golden seal, which is a sensitive plant that needs to be used sparingly. Hydrastis canadensis is the name for that. They have this mechanism where antibacterial resistant cells have this pump in them. And so they basically like antibiotics enter the cell, and there's this pump that just then sends the antibiotics out the cell and no harm done to the bacteria. These berberine containing plants actually break that pump in a ways. I mean, I think that's a very simplistic way to describe it, but essentially that's what's happening. They're not letting that happen. So, and those plants themselves are not necessarily antibiotics, right? They don't kill everything. They're not systemic in nature, but they can be used to help, in some situations could be used to help make antibiotics more workable because they're breaking that pump system. And then another, I think even a more brilliant way that herbs can be used in the so-called like antibiotic situation is that they can stimulate our immune system. So, I mean, our immune system is just amazing. It is so incredible what our immune system does. I mean, without it, obviously we wouldn't make it long. So that is really our like number one source of, avoiding these infections. So herbs can come in and they can help stimulate. Sometimes it's not even as simple as like stimulating something. Like it's not just like putting your foot on the gas of your immune system, but they do something what's called modulate the immune system, which means that, if you gave these immune modulators to 20 different people, it's not like they're going to have the exact same course of action with each of those people. Those herbs and often mushrooms are immunomodulators. They're going to interact with that person's immune system, and they might, decrease excessive activity, which is why they're often used for things like seasonal allergies, and then increase beneficial activities, like increasing phagocytosis, for example. So there's just so many ways that they can, work. We're again addressing tissue states, so helping things not adhere to cell walls, stopping biofilm production or quorum sensing. And, they could be directly antimicrobial. That works as well. They might be assisting, like decreasing the bacteria's effectiveness. So many ways that they can be used as antibiotics. But yeah, you have to think about them differently. It's not, it's not as simple as just taking an antibiotic pill once a day. But luckily, it also doesn't have, as you said, those negative consequences of wiping out all bacteria.
I mean, I think anybody listening to that description is like, all right, sign me up. I want to have some on hand for the next, thing I get so that maybe I can avoid taking antibiotics or even applying an antibiotic, cream or something like that. So I have some sort of logistical questions about accessing herbs, because I still think it's so foreign from most people's thought process when any sort of ailment comes up, both acute, they hurt themselves falling down the stairs, or chronic, and they want to address something, but they just say, go to the doctor, right? And the herbs are not going to be in the doctor's tool belt. So it doesn't come up. And so they really have to understand how to access them to do so. So first of all, I know you talked about teas, capsule or supplement forms, tinctures, topical balms or salves. What are the best delivery methods, and are any more effective than others, or is it just preference?
Yeah, it's kind of like all of them have their time and place, and that could depend on the herb. Sometimes an herb is better, it might be a stronger way to have it is an alcohol extract, but sometimes it's stronger as a tea. So the herb can play a role in like what the best way it is to work with that herb. Another thing that can play a difference in is, what are you experiencing? So like, for example, if somebody had just like, this is kind of a silly example, but if someone had a fungal infection, I wouldn't be recommending a syrup made with lots of sugar. Or if someone had a sore throat, I wouldn't be like, take these capsules. I would want something, like a throat spray that goes directly on the throat, or a tea that goes directly on the throat. So it's kind of, all of it is, it changes how you take the herbs, change according to the herb and according to the situation. Could be according to the person too. You mentioned, if you're drinking the Chinese teas that tasted horrible, I've done that too. It can be pretty bad. And so it can be hard to talk someone into doing that, to drink this like horribly tasted, lots of liquid that tastes very bad. That's not always an easy easy way to go. Sometimes it's just truly best to do that way, because you're getting in like lots of herbs. Like if you remember, making those teas, it was often probably like a handful or two of herbs that went into that.
Oh yeah, it was a very thick consistency. Like a normal tea is not thick at all, right? It's pretty much
to cook
water
down for a long time.
But yeah, it was very much like thicker than hot chocolate almost.
So yummy.
Hot chocolate,
so
yummy.
Healing, right? We're so grateful because it is so healing.
So grateful, so disgusting.
But yeah, so taking a tincture, it's often easier, but it's not always like the best way, because with a tincture, in order to get like that much herb in that big of a dosage, you would have to take ounces of alcohol, which of course is not something that's generally recommended. So it depends on like how much the dose is for that herb. And so what's the best of preparation according to the dosage. So yeah, there's
also,
a lot.
I was thinking about my brother's kids. They don't want to consume anything that doesn't taste good, but he'll like dump some capsules of herbs into their smoothie and they can't tell. So there's like little things like that where, sometimes a certain type is better than other. Okay. Another question for you on kind of logistics and access. How does somebody tell herbal quality? Is it organic versus not organic? Are there other certifications or things to look for? Are any herbs at risk of being, heavily sprayed with chemicals or containing mold or anything like that?
Yeah, there's a lot to consider when it comes to sourcing herbs. And potency, of course, depends on all sorts of things. And one of the best ways is to know the herbs. And so when you taste them organoleptically or smell them, that you're able to say like, yeah, this is good stuff. That might sound, I don't know, complicated, but if you think about like, tomato fresh from the garden versus like a tomato in December in the northern climates that tastes like cardboard, it's not like that difficult to tell when you know if an herb is a high quality or not. So it's good to know that. And that's one thing with like buying capsules. If you can't see, smell, taste that herb very well, then it's going to be tough to know, is this high quality? And when it comes to adulteration and poor quality herbs, capsules are the most common way that, those are going to happen because it's easy to hide them. If you're looking at like, if you're buying a bulk herb of chamomile and you're looking at those beautiful dried flowers, you can tell that is chamomile. You can smell it, you can see it, and you can say, this is good stuff. When things are in capsules, it's much more difficult to find that out. Certifications can matter. Especially if herbs are coming from overseas, because anytime there's a certification like organic or fair trade or fair wild, which is an important one, if there's a certification, then those herbs are tracked all the way from the source through the whole process. They're tested along the way. They have to meet certain requirements, versus no certification. Sometimes herbs across the globe will trade hands 15 times. And so you just don't even know like what happened to them along the way. And a friend of mine, Dr. Ann Armbrecht, she just wrote a book called The Business of Botanicals looking at this. And that book just like blew my mind. Like I just had no idea. She actually traveled the world and looked at herbs from their source through the supply chain, to our kitchens, basically. And what she saw, is basically like, you absolutely want to have organic certification. And you definitely want fair trade certification, because the way that people are treated makes a big difference, not only ethically in their own lives, but also when you're paying someone well and treating them with respect, they are in turn, investing their lives and getting good quality herbs. She talked about all sorts of things that she saw along the way of, like people reusing old cement bags to harvest their herbs into, and that cement getting, mixed in with the herbs. That is not uncommon. So it's important to think about it, because as we said before, herbs aren't standardized. And so how they are grown, how they're harvested, how they're processed, all of that plays a role in their potency. And so you want to do as best as you can to make sure that all of those steps were taken along the way. Of course, that's like thinking globally, because a lot of our herbs like turmeric or cinnamon come from overseas. But whenever we can get herbs more direct from the source, that's great. And there's actually a lot of herbal farms in North America where you can get herbs directly from the source if you're doing bulk herbs. Or there's, it's about choosing trusted companies that are doing a lot for not only ensuring that their herbs are high quality, but are establishing relationships with people at the source And so,
So of course, now you have to tell me what some of your favorite herbal companies are, because I'm sure that will be a question people have.
Yeah, absolutely. For buying bulk herbs and teas, Mountain Rose Herbs is one of my favorites. They're an online apothecary, and they do so much, proactive things supporting small farmers. They have a really rigorous testing, looking at, making sure that the herbs that they're selling are high quality. They have great prices, and everything, is organic and fair trade and fair wild in some situations. There's great tea companies out there that are doing a really excellent job, like Traditional Medicinals is a good one that's very popular. And Puka, Pukka, that's another great one that's doing, proactive things to make sure they have the best herbs and they're treating everyone in the process with respect and giving them a living wage. So yeah, those are a handful of ones.
I was going to say Puka and Traditional Medicinal are basically two of the three tea brands that I drink. And I want to just mention very quickly that if somebody listening to this doesn't have a chronic health issue that they would go see a registered herbalist for, or some sort of acute burn or nausea, drinking herbal teas, especially some of the, things like milk thistle, which is so supportive to the liver, or, some of these will have like the function on the front, right? Digestive aid, this and that. It's just the most amazing way to kind of like drink medicine all day and hydrate. And it keeps you from drinking like some other kind of, flavored seltzer, like whatever the heck you might drink otherwise. But I've seen so much great research, which I'm sure you've seen as well, about one specifically men that in China, it was a Chinese study that drank 3 or more cups a day of tea had significantly lower rates of like heart disease and other cardiovascular issues. And it's just, you're drinking medicine all day. It's so easy compared to then having a chronic health issue and having to maybe take these more intense herbs that will, target and heal. So I just tell that to everybody. And Puka and Traditional Medicinals are two fantastic brands. And I have heard of Mountain Rose Herbs as well. So I'm glad that you like them. Okay, so those are some great recommendations. Since we are in the time of COVID, can you talk a little bit about some popular natural antivirals that people can have on hand should they contract COVID, and also how you would take those, whether it's tea or capsule form?
Yeah. So with antivirals, viruses are interesting. We talked about bacteria. Bacteria have this cell wall that can be invaded and they can be disrupted in that way. But viruses don't have cell walls, and they replicate by attaching to our own cells and replicating in that way. So antivirals, this idea of like, sometimes I think people think like, oh, antibiotics kill bacteria, antivirals kill viruses. But it's not quite that way, because we can't just like kill all of our cells, right, that have been invaded. So it's a little bit more complex, I guess, in a way. The first way that I think of antivirals is, as we talked about, immunomodulators. So immunomodulators are herbs that we take to help bolster our immune system. And again, it's not just about simply stimulating the immune system, but it's about them having this complex relationship with our immune system that helps to kind of challenge and stimulate it in a way that makes it overall more resilient. And that, I feel like, right now in the time of COVID, but before I used to talk about this, like basically like the cold and flu season, but certainly now with COVID, like I think it's a great idea for all of us to be taking immunomodulators every day. Why not? Why not be strengthening our immune system the best that we can? So just that just makes sense to me. Some of my favorite immunomodulators are things like mushrooms. And I take like a blend of mushrooms almost every day from Fungi Perfecti, but lots of those things like reishi, turkey tail, lots of good ones in there. Another favorite is a Chinese herb, one of my very favorite Chinese herbs, which is astragalus root. And astragalus root is a sweet root. It can be taken every day. It has so many gifts to it and is a wonderful immunomodulator. One of my favorite combinations is actually astragalus and reishi together. And what I like to do is combine those two and then add spices like ginger and cinnamon and cardamom and make those up into a spiced tea. And that's one of my favorite things. We drink that all winter long. It's delicious. And you're taking these amazing herbs like astragalus and reishi that have so many benefits, even beyond immunomodulation.
When you say you take them, you mentioned a tea that you made, but are you mostly taking them in tea form?
It depends. With astragalus and reishi, especially astragalus, the dosage is pretty high. You could go anywhere from 10 grams to 30 grams, which in capsules, we're talking like 20 to 60 capsules a day. Not fun. It's expensive, plus like just not fun, right? So in that situation, I'm using the bulk herbs because you can use a handful of bulk herbs and make it into a tea and then drink the tea. It's better than drinking or taking 60 capsules. I drink a lot of teas. Like you said, there's so many benefits to teas, but you can take them in different ways. When I say tea too, you want to decoct them is the term, which basically means to simmer them for an extended period of time, 1 or 2 hours even. One thing I like to do is put them in a crock pot overnight or, put them in an Instant Pot and let them cook a long time like that. So you don't have to be like at the cook stove, for a couple hours monitoring your tea. So that's a way to do that.
So for my lazy listeners or my, time-strapped new moms or whatever, are there any that you would take in like capsule form or just like a tincture that would be kind of fast that you might purchase?
Yeah, the Fungi Perfecti, they have a lot of great mushroom blends, and those can be taken in capsules. So that can be an easy way to do that.
Okay, great. I just wanted to give something to the people who are willing to do the work and for the people who are not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one more question for you. I can't believe how much time we have left. We're coming up on the end here, but I have a couple more because it's just so interesting to me. Mm-hmm. So this is just for antivirals in general, but let's say somebody came to you or somebody came to the hospital, they were confirmed COVID positive. If there was a concoction of antiviral herbs that you might prescribe as a registered herbalist, if they were working with you, how might those be adjusted to account for maybe some other things about them that make them unique? Or, how does like custom blending work? What would you change out about somebody that has lupus? Basically, what's that process of deciding what a custom blend looks like?
Well, just kind of to continue on with like the viral standpoint. So we have immunomodulators, which we can, use now to keep ourselves healthy. If we get sick, then we can use herbs that inhibit viral replication. And so, that's basically like the virus comes in, it gets into our cells, they start replicating. There's herbs that actually stop that replication process, which then allows our immune system to have more of an upper hand and not be like, being taken advantage of by the virus. So an example of that is elderberry. And elderberry is one that herbalists love to take at the onset of a cold or flu. It has created a lot of interest for COVID, but at this point, we don't have any, human clinical trials looking at COVID-19 and botanicals. There are, some that are being recommended and some studies that are in the works. We're still kind of waiting on that. But we do know that elderberry is an amazing herb for all sorts of other coronaviruses, cold and flu. And so in that way, we can say like, maybe it'll work, for COVID, why not? Time will tell. But that, stopping that viral replication can be really important. So that's kind of like the onset of an illness. That's like kind of when is a great time to like ramp up herbal medicine at the onset of an illness, because you have the chance. Like I can't tell you how many times I felt scratchy throat, felt I was coming down with something, and then taken elderberry and had those symptoms go away. So it's loved for that. It's famous for that. Lots of human clinical trials looking at that. Also looking at it from a prevention standpoint. So elderberry is loved for that. But then once the illness settles in, we start having symptoms, right? So we might have a cough, a fever, aches and pains, those sort of things. And in that situation, we can start using herbs, which a friend of mine, Jim McDonald, calls these indirect antivirals, in the sense that we're going to be using herbs for a viral infection. We're not necessarily killing the virus, but we can be assisting our body to help, build strength and work against the virus. And so, like, let's just take coughs real quick. People have probably experienced a cough in their life. And if you've had a cough, you probably had several, and not all coughs are the same. Sometimes you have a dry spasmodic cough where you just like can't stop coughing. I often get those at like the end of an illness. Like I'll lay down to bed at night thinking like, okay, finally I'm going to rest. And then like I just start coughing, this dry spasmodic cough, can't stop it. So there's that type of cough. Then there's like coughs where our chests are so congested, right? We have like all this mucus in our chest and we cough and it might feel tight to breathe because there's just so much going on in our lungs. So we have a congested cough. Like with herbalism, we don't use the same herbs. Like there's no herbs for coughs, right? Instead, we're thinking like, what's going on with this body? So in this situation, like let's say that dry spasmodic cough, well, there's dryness, right? We know like this dryness is super irritating and it's causing this reflexive action of coughing, which is so painful. And so if we just stop the cough, which is what over-the-counter medicines will do, right? They'll just like stop the cough, which gives you symptomatic relief, which, can be very soothing and needed at times, but it doesn't address the dryness, right? So we can use herbs that actually bring moisture specifically to our respiratory system and help address that dryness. They aren't necessarily, there to stop the cough, but what they're saying is like, oh, we're going to help soothe these tissues so there isn't that irritation. So the coughing doesn't need to happen anymore.
So the customization that you're talking about is more around the actual symptoms and what people are experiencing than just like their health profile, it sounds like.
No, that's a really great question, Adrienne. In this acute situation, we're mostly concerned with the acute symptoms. So when I often tell people, it's like, we're not like getting on this like philosophical train of like, who is this person and what is their life? Like when they have a dry, irritating cough or a congested cough, we're thinking like, all right, let's address that symptom and get them relief. And so we personalize based on the symptoms. But when we're thinking about chronic health or simply maintaining good health, in herbal medicine, many systems of herbal medicine from a traditional perspective use a constitutional model. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's like, I've kind of been like dancing around that of like, how is Western medicine different from herbs? It's this constitutional model that often plays a big role. And with that, where the constitutional model is looking, it kind of sounds strange, but it's something that we have all experienced. And it's looking at these 4 qualities of hot and cold and damp and dry. And those are like the very basics of them. But I know we've all experienced this, like maybe you're someone who is naturally warmer than other people around you. And you'll notice like, I'm in a t-shirt when other people are wearing a sweater and, I rarely feel cold. Or the opposite, someone's feeling like, I'm always got my sweater on, even in the summer. And, I often feel like it's hard to get warmed up or, my hands are constantly cold. That's kind of this like very simplistic view, but this opening view into where like looking at how we are different constitutionally. And same with dryness and dampness. Some people are like, oh, my skin is constantly dry. No matter what lotion I put on, it's never, restoring to a natural balance, et cetera. So we're looking at these different qualities of hot and cold and damp and dry. And that gives us a really good perspective or constitutional model about who that person is. And then we choose herbs based on that. And that's one way that when people try to use like herbs for such and such condition, that it can be difficult for them. So for example, if 2 people have digestive problems and they look up, what herb is good for digestion, and they find out that ginger is great for digestion, which we know it generally is. Well, ginger, if you've had the experience of having ginger tea or ginger in a meal or just a little bite of ginger, it's spicy, right? It's very warming. And if somebody already has a lot of heat in their body and their digestive complaints are actually related to heat, then having that ginger is probably not going to be a very good match for them. They're looking for something.
My Chinese herbalist used to look at my tongue before, when I would come in for each new formula, he would check out my tongue and see, I assumed, these different constitutional aspects.
Yeah, exactly right? It. Yeah. Yeah. Like the color of your tongue, the shape of your tongue, the coating of your tongue. That's like one way. Like I gave the example of like, how does the person feel? That's one way. Looking at the tongue, checking the pulse, hearing more symptoms that generally affect that person. Each one of those is like taken into the full account. There's not just like the one thing you do, but it's really like, how does all of this inform who this person is and what they might need? I think that's one of the most brilliant things about herbalism. Obviously, it's not the simplest because it does take time to learn. And there are more sophisticated symptoms like Chinese medicine, you often go to school for 8 years to learn all these different constitutional patterns. And so it can take time, but I think that we all know on some level these things, and it can really be as simple as it's a hot summer's day, you got, sweat dripping down your back and you're feeling super parched and maybe your skin feels flushed. Are you thinking in that moment, oh, what I really want is the thick cup of hot cocoa or, a steaming bowl of chili. That's what I really want right now. No, right? We're thinking where's the watermelon? Where can I get the lemonade? How can I cool off? And, vice versa, in the middle of winter, you're freezing cold, you've been out skiing, you can't really feel your fingers kind of thing. You're not thinking oh, I'm so cold inside, I can't wait to have some ice cream. Well, maybe, but really, you're more thinking of that hot cup of tea and that warming soup. So that's in essence, what we're talking about. I know we have an experience of that within ourselves, of everyday experience. And these constitutional models are just looking at deeper and deeper manifestations of that throughout our whole body. So that deeper look does take a little bit more time, but I think, we are the best experts for our bodies. And when we start to pay attention to that, we can really get a lot of insight.
Got it. Okay. So I've got 2 more questions for you, and then I promise I'll let you go. The first is, you mentioned, Chinese herbalists, for example, go to school for 8 years, which last time I checked, that's the same or longer as a medical doctor. So that's quite a bit of training. You have gone to school for, it sounds like 8 years of clinical training, which is super extensive. So what is the difference between, if somebody wanted to see a registered herbalist, which you are, which is an RH, right? Is there some sort of database where they can look up and find one nearby? Is there, major differences between somebody trained in Chinese herbology, for example, or Ayurvedic herbology or Western herbology? I know there are some differences, but is there sort of an overlying accreditation today, or do they all receive the same amount of clinical training? Or can you tell me a little bit about those differences?
Yeah, that is kind of a gray area within the herbal world. Within Chinese medicine, there's, Chinese medicine schools that are often, acupuncture and herbalism, and they have their own certification and process. And so that's often separate from, say, Western herbalism. And the registered herbalist, that comes from the American Herbalist Guild. What they do is, they're basically, the application process is you're showing them that you have this minimum amount of study that they put forth, so many hours of materia medica, so many hours of pathology, et cetera. And then you also have to have, so many hours of actual clinical work too, in order to get that certification. So, that's kind of those distinction between those two. There are herbalists too who practice who don't have the registered herbalist certification. And kind of like we talked about, there's somebody is having a little bit of digestive problems and they can use some help, or they want to know how to use herbs for colds and flu. And that can be, you don't need to have thousands of hours of clinical training to be able to do those things. Those everyday health ailments can often, have a more simplistic approach. But when you start to get into things like Lyme, that, not only needs a clinical herbalist who has extensive experience, but oftentimes, especially with Lyme, somebody who's then focused their clinical time, their experience on that particular disease, because it is so vastly complex. So
And how would somebody search for that?
So the American Herbalist Guild, their website, which I'm pretty sure is AmericanHerbalistGuild.com, they have a listing of their practitioners. And so you can search, most people do long distance consultations even before COVID. That was a thing. But now, especially with COVID, that's a thing. And so you can look for people all over. You can look for their qualifications, their, what they specialize in. But it's also listed, I believe, by location. So you can find, if you're looking for someone who might be in your neighborhood, so to speak, you might be able to find that as well.
Okay, that's so super helpful. All right, my last question for you, and this one is broad, so don't feel like you need to, you could probably write up your 3rd book on this topic, but herbalism is so powerful, and it's really the original medicine, right? Used by every different civilization for thousands of years. Western medicine is a fetus or an embryo in the scheme of medicine, right? It's like 100 years old and has nothing on the length and therefore the wisdom of herbalism, whether that's in India, China, Native Americans, South Americans, like pretty every civilization besides Europeans, and even, Europeans pre-Western medicine had their own, herbal methodologies. So what needs to happen for herbalism to become more mainstream, i.e., prescribed as a form of medicine by a conventional doctor when you go in for nausea, or sold in a mainstream drugstore like a CVS? Or do you think herbalism should stay separate from Western medicine?
That's a really good question. I definitely believe, and this, is my both experienced and biased opinion, that it would be so much better for people if herbs were more of a first approach before more invasive, methods were used, or things, that had more serious side effects. So I definitely believe that there's a place, most people could benefit from herbal medicine at some point in their lives. In terms of how would it happen for it to get more mainstream or be prescribed by Western medicine? One thing that we haven't yet talked about is that herbalism also offers us an opportunity to recognize that we are a part of nature and a part of this earth, and we just cannot separate ourselves from it. In Western medicine, they do like to separate us from things. So
I always say, when you take a plant, whether you take it by eating it or you take it in herbal form, your body recognizes it because you're both part of the same natural world. You're both cells and water and whatever, versus a pharmaceutical has been created by human beings and therefore is synthetic, right? So your body doesn't recognize it, which is why it induces side effects often, because your body is reacting in a strange way. Whereas your body's like, oh, hello, old friend, plant, herb. Like, we are part of the same mold, which I just think is, it sounds a little hippy-dippy, but I think it's a cool way to think about it.
I love how you said that, and the recognition of, things like seasons matter and weather matters. You'll commonly hear someone says like, oh, I can feel the weather changing because my arthritis picks up or something. It's like, we are living, breathing beings as a part of this greater ecosystem of the earth. I just imagine like going to a clinic and sitting down, with someone in a white coat in this room that has 4 white walls, and they, listen to my list of symptoms and they like prescribe an herb for it. Or probably what's more likely is a constituents based on, extracted from an herb. We're really missing out on a lot that herbalism has to offer in that situation. And so I think that, that connection to nature, recognizing that we're all part of this, looking at things like you mentioned, when you went and saw the person who was helping you with Lyme, your formula changed. That's another thing of just like, there's not this like static thing. It's not one herb for everybody, but this, complex mixture that's always changing. I say that all the time. Like, nothing in nature is static. We are not static. Everything is always changing. You think about the weather. Does the weather just stay the same all the time? No, nothing in nature does. So I think, there's this kind of, there's a greater philosophy that I don't think, it's going to take a long time before Western medicine is adopting this greater philosophy of natural health. So that's kind of one thing. Another thing is herbal demand. Just in the past year with COVID, we actually saw a huge demand on herbs. People turning to that as an answer. And we've also seen herbalism grow in popularity even in the past 2 decades. And the thing is, like, herbs, they're a renewable resource, but there's a limited amount of resource. And so we have to, as herbalism grows in popularity and as more people turn to herbs, we need to be thinking about that. How are we growing and harvesting herbs sustainably? The soils that the herbs are in really matter. Some would even argue that to grow herbs like in rows, as a monocrop is not as great as like them growing in a meadow with all sorts of other plants around them, which makes it really hard to harvest them, which increases the price. Anyway, there's just supply issues we need to think about as that grows, because with herbalism too, we get to see directly that the health of my environment, the health of the plants directly affects my health, right? If the plants aren't resilient, if they're not potent, then that's going to affect my health. And then, of course, I mean, this is kind of same with food, right? If we're eating like so-called healthy food, but it's grown, in these huge farms that are sprayed with all sorts of stuff, where workers are sick, the soil is sick. Even if it's like a tomato, which is supposedly healthy, like we're not going to benefit a lot from that. So we have to think about that with herbs too.
A non-organic tomato is not the same as an organic tomato, which, and the same is definitely true with all plants, including herbal plants. So what you're saying is you're probably not going to see herbs in, high quality herbs in a CVS or something anytime soon. But that's actually the magic of the time that we're in with the internet, things are so much more accessible. Just because your local drugstore doesn't have X, Y, or Z, if you're an empowered person and patient, you can start to do this stuff on your own and access these high quality herbs from companies that, someone like you would use as a person that just wants to take some antivirals to make sure that COVID, doesn't have much of an effect on them should they get it or something like that. So I think, the modern world is very toxic and very sad in that way, because our sources, herbs or plant, food or whatever, are really compromised. And as you said, as demand grows, it gets more compromised, but also there's greater access. So that's good. So
it's important to just be, informed as somebody who buys herbs, and to think about it, like, where did these herbs come from? How were they treated? How were the people treated? All of those things really do matter.
Awesome. Well, Rosalee, thank you so much. I could stay on here for 3 more hours with you. I have so many questions. And obviously buying both or, one of your books is something I have to do, because I clearly want to go deeper into this for my own knowledge. But I hope that, people buy your books and go deeper and become herbalists themselves and access registered herbalists for any kind of chronic health issues or symptoms as they come up, and stock their medicine cabinet with things that can, become part of their daily tools for both prevention and, everyday little ailments that might come up, or an acute thing like a wound or something, because they're so powerful and I think relatively inexpensive, and really, as I just said, accessible in a way that they probably weren't 30 years ago, 20 years ago even. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. It was so great to have you.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. It's a really fun conversation for me. So thanks for having me, Adrienne.
Thanks everyone for listening. And now I'd love to know, what's an action you can take now to see if herbs might be helpful to you? Whether you're healing something or just want to prevent something in the future and optimize your health naturally. Is it find an herbalist or go to the health food store and ask about some of the herbs Rosalee mentioned in this episode, or simply making a cup of herbal tea right now? And if you've had experience with herbalism, what did you use herbs for? How did they help? Whatever your experience has been, make sure you leave a comment on the article version of this episode on getwellbe.com, and you'll find a link to it in the show notes. It's helpful for the entire WellBe community to know your takeaway and your insight. Also, while you're there, become a WellBe Insider so that you can get all of our latest content, special offers, and personal notes I don't share anywhere else weekly in your inbox. Plus, you'll get a free copy of my audio guide on how to feel the best you've ever felt and heal anything. The 10 things you need to optimize your health and heal any health issue, big or small, naturally. Even if you're the healthiest person out there, I promise you'll learn something from this audio guide that you didn't know before that can help you to optimize your health. I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the WellBe Podcast. If you haven't already and found this episode helpful or interesting, subscribe to the podcast. This way you'll never miss a new episode and they'll be delivered to you whenever we publish a new one. And please share this episode with family or friends who you think might find it valuable and informative. It means a lot and helps more people find the podcast. If you already have, then thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Once again, this is your host, Adrienne Nolan-Smith, and thanks for listening to the WellBe Podcast.